Show. This is going to be fun. We're going to be talking to Dr. Jeff Thompson. And of course, we got Dave Plouffe. He is thrilled to meet and talk to Dr. Jeff Thompson tonight. So there you go. Hey. Be back.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
It's getting crazier out there. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Late Late Horror Show once again. Make sure you hit that thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the description below where the books to the guest tonight, Dr. Jeff Thompson, is. We are all fans of Dark Shadow here. Kolchak, Dan Curtis, everything we're going to talk about tonight. But really quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Dave to introduce Dr. Jeff Thompson. I got to say hi to everybody in the chat. Connie Clary, Edward Stewart, what's going on? Welcome to the channel. Sama Chandler, I do believe. William Cromer, what's going on? Edward Stewart. Black Roses was here. Tune the News. Andrea. Debbie Grabowski, what is going on? I'm not sure what that's about. A detective tonight. But whatever, it is what it is. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, Dave, thank you once again, Dr. Jeff Thompson, for being on the show tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Dave, introduce him, and let's have some fun and let's talk.
All right. So Dr. Jeff Thompson is a retired professor from Tennessee State University. He began teaching in 1985. I was so young. I still remember that year, though.
You were born, right?
Yeah, I was born. I was born actually pre-Kolchak. He's taught classes in early and modern American literature, honors world literature 1 and 2. He's written books on Dan Curtis, 3 of them. The television horrors of Dan Curtis, Night of Dan Curtis, House of Dan Curtis, a number of also writings on Dark Shadows. Also, he wrote, and I want to talk a little bit about this too, parts of, but about the movie Somewhere in Time, which is one of our favorites, and we're a big fan of Art Bell here, and that's one of Art Bell's favorite movies about time travel. Wrote liner notes for CDs on music from Dracula and Burnt Offerings. And if I remember, that's one of the Jack Palances.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, perfect. And today we're going to talk everything really about Dan Curtis. And even though Kolchak came out January 11th, 1972, Dino and I both came very late to Kolchak.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of a joke between us. Some of my friends told me to watch Kolchak for like 6 years before I did it. And I saw it and I loved it, told Dino about it. It was another 6 years before he saw it.
Yeah, I wouldn't even, I had too much to watch and I didn't even get to Kolchak. But then a few years later, after Dave keep telling, watch it, I finally watched it. How long ago, Dave? Not too long ago.
Maybe 2 years.
2 years ago. And yeah, I mean, the movie's fantastic, and I just got hooked. We could talk about the TV series here as we go along, but yeah, didn't mean to interrupt, Dave. Go ahead.
That's okay. And I was just going to ask, can I call you Jeff? Is that all right?
Oh, yes, please do.
Thank you. Were you one of the lucky ones who saw it on TV when it aired?
Yes, in the fall of 1974, I was 15. And I was watching Planet of the Apes and Kolchak the Night Stalker. Not every Friday night, unfortunately, because I was in the marching band. And on many Friday nights, I, was at the football field marching in the band. But I got to see many of the episodes and then the summer reruns. And then Kolchak the Night Stalker ran on the CBS late movie for many years, and a few episodes came out on VHS. Here's a VHS tape with the episodes The Ripper and the Vampire. But of course, both original movies, The Night Stalker and The Night Strangler, are on VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray. And now the TV show has come out on Blu-ray. I have it on DVD, but I know that it now is out on Blu-ray with a lot of really good extras. Now, you all have read Mark Dawidziak's book, haven't you? The Night Stalker Companion.
No, I know about it. I've heard Mark talk several times, but I have not read that. I've only read Kendall Phillips' book on Kolchak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mark Dawidziak's book is very, very good, and he's working on a revised second edition of it right now. So I'm looking forward to reading that, because I depended a lot on his original book when I began working on my books about Dan Curtis. Not much had been written about Curtis, even though he is, so ubiquitous and influential. In 2006, I was getting ready to write my doctoral dissertation, and I thought about writing about film noir in general, or maybe Chinatown in particular.
Nice.
But there have been so many books about film noir. And at that time, Dan Curtis died. And a website, an e-newsletter called Scoop, asked me to write Dan Curtis's obituary. And so I did. I wrote his obituary very quickly and comprehensively. And then I thought to myself, well, I have read about and studied Dan Curtis and watched all of his movies, for 30 years. And so I should write my doctoral dissertation about Dan Curtis, because he needs more documentation and more recognition. So that was the origin of my first writings about Dan Curtis. I, of course, had written about Dark Shadows and other Dan Curtis productions for fanzines like The World of Dark Shadows and magazines like Midnight Marquee and Movie Club. But I wrote the dissertation about Dan Curtis, and then it was luckily the right length and right style and format for McFarland to publish it. So I just reshaped it slightly and sent it to McFarland, and it was published and nominated for a Rondo Award.
Nice.
And in recent years, 2019, 2020, I put out revised second editions of my 3 books, because I keep learning more and more about Dan Curtis, and more things keep happening in the world of Dark Shadows, such as a Dan Curtis documentary and a Jonathan Frid documentary. So I did revised second editions of all 3 of the books. The television horrors of Dan Curtis focuses on, of course, the horror productions, but all 3 of my books discuss all 4 dozen of Curtis's productions. House of Dan Curtis goes a little more deeply into the mysteries and crime dramas, and then Nights of Dan Curtis is all about his great epic productions of Dracula, The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang, The Winds of War, War and Remembrance, and his UFO miniseries Intruders. After I wrote House of Dan Curtis, which is a play on the name of the movie House of Dark Shadows, but I was referring to the production house of Dan Curtis, several of my fan friends said, well, now if you've written House of Dan Curtis, you have to write Night of Dan Curtis. So I wrote Nights, plural, of Dan Curtis, all about the many nights that we sat in front of the TV watching The Winds of War and War and Remembrance and Dracula, and of course all 4 dozen of his productions that are mentioned in the books.
Man, those late night movie nights when we were teens, right? They were just so great.
Oh, yes.
You were going to say something, Dave?
Well, I was just going to ask which film you liked better, Kolchak the Night Stalker or The Night Strangler. Because for me, I loved The Night Stalker, and I think that's just a perfect film. So many great actors in that. In The Night Strangler, I love it because it's almost an homage to all the other horror people. When you have Grandpa Munster, You've got The Wicked Witch of the West. You got Carradine. It's such a great film.
The Seattle
Yes.
Underground. Yes.
Right. The Seattle Underground. I visited that in May of 2000 and saw an old prop from the Night Strangler that had been left there. But
Really?
yes, it was
Wow.
a love seat. The tour guide pointed it out. He said that love seat is left over from the movie The Night Strangler.
Nice. Okay.
Well, it's always hard, most sequels are not quite as good as the originals, although, some are just as good, maybe even better, like The Godfather Part 2 or Gremlins 2 or Scream 2 or Curtis's Kansas City Massacre, his second Melvin Purvis movie. And Joe Dante himself said that he really likes The Night Strangler. He says there's a lot of good things going on in that movie. He stops just short of saying it's better. But I enjoy both, but I really do enjoy The Night Strangler because it builds on The Night Stalker. Of course, The Night Stalker is more original. That's the original concept from Jeff Rice's novel and Richard Matheson's script. And the whole, premise of the down on his luck reporter who stumbles onto something supernatural and nobody believes him, but he defeats the supernatural menace, but then gets thrown out of town for his trouble. And that was repeated in The Night Strangler, but amplified and built upon because the humor and the comedy in the second movie were broader. The arguments between Kolchak and Vincenzo were longer and louder. And a few elements from the original Jeff Rice novel that didn't make it into the first movie, Matheson incorporated into the second, such as the sketch artist drawing a sketch of the suspect, and the moment when Kolchak throws something through Vincenzo's glass window and breaks it really happened. Jeff Rice was a reporter for the Las Vegas Sun, and he worked with a reporter, an eccentric, unusual reporter named Alan Jarlson. And their editor was an irascible, belligerent type like Vincenzo. And the editor fired Alan Jarlson about 14 times in the 2 years that Jeff Rice worked there. And Rice witnessed all of these, altercations and quarrels and disagreements. And one included throwing something through the glass window. So Matheson was very faithful to the novel when he adapted both movies. He said, I didn't have to do much because everything was already there. The character, the situation, it was almost a perfect book. Now, of course, Matheson and Curtis and the director of the first movie, John Llewellyn Moxey, and Darren McGavin himself tweaked and added a few things. In the novel, the Kolchak character is Romanian, and grew up listening to stories about vampires that his grandfather told him. So that character, that iteration of the character, believes in vampires. And that was the only thing that Matheson found fault with. He said, well, if he already believes in vampires, where can he go from there? His character needs to change or grow. So I'm going to make him completely unfamiliar with anything supernatural so that when he stumbles upon the vampire, it's a much bigger shock to him and to us, the audience, especially because the movie is realistic in that everything that happens really could happen, except probably there is not a vampire in Las Vegas, but it's presented in a realistic way as if, well, if there really was a vampire in Las Vegas, this is what would happen. Matheson said when he read the book, he said, to me, it felt real. It felt like cinema verite. Now, I guess we would say guerrilla filmmaking, or maybe a term even newer than that. But so Matheson was very pleased with what he read and did not have to add or change much other than a little bit about the Kolchak character. And then Darren McGavin himself changed the wardrobe. It was his idea to wear the seersucker suit and the straw hat. In the novel, I think the character is described as liking to wear Hawaiian shirts and shorts. And McGavin, who is always thinking in terms of I'm an actor and who is the character and what is my motivation, said, well, to me, there's a line in the script that says he wants to get back to New York. He wants to get back to the big time. He used to be in New York, but something happened and now he's in Las Vegas, but he wants to go back. And so McGavin devised a character in which he said, well, this guy was fired maybe 10 years ago from New York, and he hasn't bought any new clothes since then. And McGavin said, I think that the summer wardrobe of New York reporters was seersucker suits and straw hats, and I added the tennis shoes. So McGavin came up with the idea for the costume. And then, of course, Matheson, Curtis, and Moxie added their own elements as well, all taking from the Jeff Rice original.
Nice.
I absolutely love that part in the Night Stalker when Darren McGavin's sitting down, and I forget the actress's name, the blonde, Lenny, maybe her last name. Carol Lindley. Thank you. And she's all, how many times have you been fired? And he's all, well, there's 3 times in Boston. There's 3 times in New York. There's once in Washington, D.C. And it just cracks me up. One of the things that if I was able to redo history, I don't think I would do the TV series. I would have loved to have seen a couple more longer films of Kolchak with Dan Curtis, with Richard Matheson. Do you think it was, I don't want to say it was a mistake to do the series, or what is your feeling about the breakup of that?
Well, sometimes the networks jump on something and wear it out. It might have been better to have a series of Perry Mason movies or a series of 5 Gunsmoke movies after the show was canceled than trying to do another whole series of it. Matheson had written the script for a 3rd movie. I think it was going to be called The Night Walker. That was a Robert Bloch movie. Okay. Maybe it was The Night Walkers or something like that, but it was set in Hawaii, and it was dealing kind of like a plot similar to Scream and Scream Again, or a plot that did turn up later on the series about android lookalikes replacing people. And so the script was all ready to go, and Matheson and Curtis wanted to do it. But ABC said, well, no, let's do a weekly series instead. And so, this may or may not have been the right decision for him, but Curtis said, oh, well, I don't want to do the series because, a monster every week, a new monster of the week, it can't be done. Now, after seeing so many years of the X-Files and Supernatural, I guess we know that a monster of the week can be done. But Curtis felt that it just he couldn't pull it off. And Matheson agreed. Matheson did not participate in the series either. Their friend William F. Nolan, Logan's Run, Burnt Offerings, might have written some scripts for it too. But as it turned out, it was a 1-season, 20-episode series that McGavin himself had a love-hate relationship with. He probably was not all that broken up that Dan Curtis was not going to be in it anymore, because the two of them really did not like each other. They both were such strong personalities that I imagine, they could not have gone the distance. So they did not care for each other. But McGavin became disenchanted with the series because he did not like the monster of the week. He wanted to branch out and make it more of a serious investigative reporting show where some weeks would not be supernatural. It would just be a crime drama. Kolchak is investigating some sort of high-level crime and captures the criminals. But I don't know whether that would have worked or not, because people were expecting, a supernatural element. And if it turned out it was an episode where he nabs embezzlers or racketeers, that might not have gone over well. Now, of course, Boris Karloff's thriller began as a mixture of crime drama, realistic crime drama, and supernatural, but it soon turned to the supernatural and did not look back. So McGavin was not all that broken up when the series ended after 20 episodes. But I really wish that you're right. I wish that there could have been a series of 4, 5, 6 90-minute or 2-hour Kolchak movies, hopefully with the participation of Dan Curtis, Richard Matheson, maybe William F. Nolan.
Yep, I agree with you. Same here. Me and Dave have talked about that many times, where as we're getting through this series, because we're watching them for the first time, and we're episode 14, I think, coming up here.
Yeah.
And we've noticed, of course, the first half of the season is really good. Lots of good stuff there, but then it's slowly starting to, you could tell they know it's not going to continue, and the storylines start getting a little, not as good, but that's where I was going to ask you, and I do agree, Dave, the Strangler's slightly more than the Stalker, but they're both great, excellent movies. I was going to say he is not the writer of Kolchak, but he's the director. How much influence did Dan Curtis have on the series itself and the 2 movies? How much involvement did he have?
Well, none on the series.
Okay.
In a minute, we can talk about the 2005 series, for which Curtis was a consultant in a very minor way. But Curtis did not direct the first movie, The Night Stalker. John Llewellyn Moxey did. He had directed episodes of The Saint and The Avengers and the movie Horror Hotel before he came to America. And because at this point, except for directing House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows, Curtis had acted as a producer. He produced The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Jack Palance, about 6 years before Dracula. But Curtis was always hands-on in everything, in a good way, of course, from script doctoring and ideas and writing to music, to set decorating, to casting, to everything. And he and Moxey got along very well. Curtis was there on the set every day and giving essentially directions to Moxey, suggestions, let's say, things that he thought might be good, might look good. And Moxey usually agreed, and they worked well together. Moxey said in an interview, Dan Curtis was fine. He was there every day and gave his input, but it was great. But then after The Night Stalker, Curtis thought to himself, well, why don't I just cut out the middleman? I get the ideas for these movies and I produce them. And then in his words, I tell the director what to say. That may or may not have been accurate, although Curtis, I bet it was. So Curtis said, well, why don't I just cut out the middleman, the director, and just direct it myself? So he directed The Night Strangler, and then, of course, went on to direct all of his horror productions, like Trilogy of Terror, Burnt Offerings, Dead of Night, Scream of the Wolf, Dracula. He and Matheson did 6 projects together and some unproduced scripts as well. So Curtis was very much involved in the making of both movies. And Matheson, in the summer of 1971, when Moxey was in Las Vegas making the first movie, Matheson and his family were on a vacation, a trip across the country. They stopped in Virginia City, Nevada, and went into a theater, and that's where Richard Matheson saw the photograph of Maude Adams on the wall and became fascinated with her. And of course, he wrote Bid Time Return, which became Somewhere in Time. But on that same trip, he and his family went to Las Vegas and observed the filming of the film for a few days. It didn't take very long to make the movie. I think it was only like about 15 days for both films. So Curtis was very much involved in the first one, and of course directed the second one. But as I said, when it came time to do a series, he said, it can't be done. We can't have a monster every week. I just don't see it. And same with Matheson. Now, Matheson, when it came time to write the second movie, Matheson's first idea was, well, how do I top a vampire in Las Vegas? What can I do? And then he thought, well, let's have Jack the Ripper be loose in modern day Seattle. But Matheson was good friends with the great Robert Bloch, author of Psycho, who was a ripperologist. He was fascinated with Jack the Ripper, just like Jack Finney and Richard Matheson were fascinated with time travel. And Matheson, had written, Robert Bloch had written Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, and other stories that had Ripper-like characters, Psycho, Enoch, Lucy Comes to Stay. Even his Star Trek episode, Wolf in the Fold, is a Jack the Ripper type spirit that possesses someone. And so Matheson called Robert Bloch, and he wanted to make sure that he wasn't stepping on Bloch's toes. I think that was very nice of Matheson because, nobody owns Jack the Ripper. Anyone could write about that personality. But Matheson called Bloch and said, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And Matheson said, I could tell that Bloch was disappointed just from the tone of his voice. I could tell that he really didn't want me to try Jack the Ripper. So Matheson said, so I came up with another idea, a little bit similar, of someone who has to kill every certain number of years in order to maintain his youth. So that's how he came up with the doctor character. Is it Richard Malcolm? That Richard Anderson of The Bionic Woman and The $6 Million Man plays so wonderfully. And Curtis said that he and Matheson tried to imbue the doctor with a little bit of sympathy, even though he was a horrible person doing horrible things. But in his mind, he was justified. I think one of the most ironic lines ever is when Malcolm says to Kolchak, what's a few lives compared to immortality? So in his mind, he was doing the right thing. But Dan Curtis liked to have a little bit of sympathy for the monster, so to speak. He certainly did that with Barnabas Collins and with Jack Palance's version of Dracula, although his Dracula was fiendish, but he had a tragic side to him. And so Curtis wanted to carry that over into the Richard Malcolm character because they hadn't done that with Janos Skorzeny, because he was not the star of the movie the way Barnabas Collins or Count Dracula or Nosferatu or someone is the star of a movie. Kolchak was the star of that movie, and everything was from Kolchak's point of view, and we are reacting with Kolchak to what the vampire is doing. So Skorzeny was more of a stock character, whereas we got to know Dr. Richard Malcolm much better and learn about his motivations and things like that. And speaking of the 2005 failed revival, ironically, only 6 of the 10 episodes aired, and the 2 really good ones never aired until the Sci-Fi Channel and DVDs. The 8th and 9th episodes were very loose remakes of The Night Stalker and The Night Strangler. And if they had started that little series with those 2, it might have succeeded. But one of them was about a vampire-like character. And then the other one was a very close remake of The Night Strangler, only with a woman who must kill every number of years in order to retain her youth.
I live in Los Angeles.
I'm sorry, Dave. Got canceled pretty quickly, though. I haven't seen any of the episodes. Is it worthy of just canceling it? Was it that bad?
Well, it like so many remakes or revivals or reinventions, it did not capture the spirit or the essence of Kolchak the Night Stalker.
Okay.
This character played by Stuart Townsend was far more upscale. He lived in a fabulous mid-century modern house. Well, how can a reporter make that much money? Maybe the very top ones can, but I doubt that a regular reporter could live like that in the Hollywood Hills. And there were a few nods to the Night Stalker. There was even a glimpse of Darren McGavin, a sort of superimposed CGI somehow, standing in the newsroom. If you looked very closely, blink and you miss it. And then his straw hat was on a hat rack, and I think there was a license plate on a car said 1972 or something. But it really did not capture the spirit of the movies or the TV show. It was okay for what it was trying to do, and it even did try to do a couple of episodes that were mostly realistic without much supernatural, except for maybe a little subplot going in the background, but that didn't work. So
I think they were 20 years too early for that, right? I think if they were to do it now, because there's such a big insurgence of Kolchak right now.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. And Dan Curtis himself thought about making a Kolchak movie in the 90s, and Nick Nolte expressed interest, but nothing was ever signed or ever finalized about that. But yes, you're right. With so many TV shows and supernatural TV shows and streaming channels and everything, now maybe another pass at Kolchak might work. But yes, if you ever get a chance to watch those episodes, they're on DVD. And like I said, look at episodes 8 and 9 if you don't want to watch any others. Although another one was written by Vince Gilligan of Breaking Bad, and that is one of the better ones. But no, it sadly sort of missed the mark and was a missed opportunity.
Yeah. By the way, I do see everybody in the chat. Barry Geekler, Paul Ham, geez, way too many people. Sin City Orange. What's up, Orange? Good to see you. Again, you guys, the description down below, you can find his book, loads of information. Listen, I'm sitting here, right, Dave, and I am just enthralled. I could say one word, and then I wait for you to just go on and start talking. You're just a wealth of knowledge, man.
Well,
are you talking to me or to Dave?
No, I'm
to you. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
100%. Go ahead, Dave.
I just wanted to make one quick note before I feel we should kind of switch to Dark Shadows a little bit, because I feel the pressure from the chat, because that's all they're mentioning.
Dark Shadows, yeah.
I live in Los Angeles, and I've been to the Bradbury Building. And I absolutely love that set for Dr. Richard Malcolm's home, and just it's wonderful. And if anyone ever gets a chance to go to that building in LA, it is very well worth it.
Oh yes, and it has shown up in many movies and TV shows. Yes.
So I think we should talk a little bit about Dark Shadows.
Yes.
I understand that was it Dan Curtis's daughters who promoted the idea of having a vampire in this show?
Yes, absolutely. The idea for Dark Shadows originated with Dan Curtis in a dream. He, like so many writers and songwriters and artists, they get ideas in their dreams. And Dan Curtis had a dream in which he vividly saw a young girl with long hair riding on a train and going to a big looming mysterious house of secrets and knocking on the door. And he said, she knocked on the door and a wolf howled, and then I woke up. So
wow.
He even dreamed in cliffhangers like the ones he gave us every day on Dark Shadows. So when Dark Shadows began, it was sort of a mysterious Peyton place, or just a couple of steps beyond the edge of night, in that it was a mystery type show, much of the flavor of the Gothic novels that were popular in the 60s and 70s, with hints of ghosts and inexplicable events, but nothing really concrete. And so the show was going to be canceled. So Curtis, brought in a ghost and then a phoenix fire creature who rises from her ashes every 100 years. But the show was going to be canceled. And so his three young daughters, who were the age that all of us kids and I were at that time watching the show, said to him, "Make it scarier." And so he thought, well, what scares me the most? A vampire. Okay, well, I'll bring on a vampire. So he did. Shakespearean actor Jonathan Frid played Barnabas Collins.
Struck gold.
And did it so well that the show became the highest rated TV show in daytime television. It went up from 6 million to 12 million to 16 to 18 million. Mm-hmm. Which nowadays, I mean, you'd have to be a NCIS or Young Sheldon or a big football game to get ratings like that. But Curtis and the writers originally planned to just let Barnabas be like the monster of the week, the monster of the next 3 months, a cycle, meaning 13 weeks in of plot in a soap opera. Because Curtis's original idea was for Barnabas to be purely evil, a marauder, as Curtis used, that word he used to describe this vampire character. And of course, when Barnabas begins, he is doing horrible, abusive things to men and women in Collinsport. So he is not sympathetic, but the way Jonathan Frid played the part, he became sympathetic, because Jonathan said, well, I didn't play the bite. I was not trying to play that. I played Barnabas as an alcoholic, as a guy with a secret, with a hang-up. He said, because that's where the conflict and the turmoil comes in. And then he said, I also played him as a liar, because Jonathan Frid said, the scariest monster in the world to me is a liar, because once you tell a lie, you have to keep telling lies and then telling another lie and another lie and another lie to cover that one. And it snowballs to the point where you're desperate and frantic and you'll do anything, even become violent, because you have lied. So that was Jonathan Frid's wonderful interpretation of Barnabas Collins. And so he started getting fan mail. One day, Dan Curtis handed him an envelope, and Jonathan Frid said, "Oh no, I thought that this was my pink slip," but no, it was a fan letter. And then the next week, he got 10 or 15 or 20 fan letters, and the next week 100. And sooner or later, he was getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fan letters, so many that he had to ask some of the fans of the show, kids our age at that time, to help him answer some of the letters. So there were some really lucky New York area fans like Jeanette Morosky and Richard Lambisi and Edward Lambisi, and others who got to meet him back then and go to one of his fan mail parties. So, so Dan Curtis was thrilled because the ratings had gone up. The Barnabas kidnapping Maggie sequence raised the ratings, but Curtis thought, well, but he's a vampire and he bites people and kills people. How can I perpetuate a vampire and keep him on the show? The original idea was for someone, maybe Dr. Julia Hoffman, to drive a stake through his heart eventually, the way Laura Collins, the Phoenix, was vanquished eventually. But Curtis said, well, why don't we go back in time and show him when he wasn't a vampire, when he was still mortal, and show how he became a vampire and what happened to him. a vengeful witch, Angelique, cursed him because he loved Josette and not Angelique. And so I think the 1795 time period in late 67, early 68 is the greatest part of the show and one of the greatest stories ever told on television. It was Shakespearean. It was tragic and quite emotional. And same on the 1991 revival of the show. So by now, Jonathan Frid as Barnabas Collins. Barnabas is a more sympathetic character, and we understand and we suffer with him when we see him, come out of the secret room in the mausoleum for the first time and realizes that he's a vampire and he has to and he needs blood. And that first day, the makeup people really went wild with the blood and the blood coming down onto his clothes and everything. They kind of backed off and toned it down after that. But that first day was very shocking. And all of this was shocking because, we had never seen ghosts on a soap opera. We had never seen Gothic horror on a soap opera. And I had watched so many of them already. And
have we had anything like it? Have we
Yeah.
had anything like it daytime wise since, really?
Well, yes. After Dark Shadows, the conventional soap operas every now and then would use a ghost or a reincarnation or a dream curse like storyline or someone with psychic powers. So every once in a while, the regular soap operas still do dip into the supernatural. Days of Our Lives certainly does.
Okay.
But
nothing like that. I mean, nothing like Dark Shadows.
No. Port Charles, a spinoff of General Hospital, added vampires and angels to its 6-year run.
Really?
And then, of course, Passions on NBC, which ran from 1999 to 07, was a supernatural soap opera with Juliet Mills, Nanny and the Professor, as Tabitha, a witch who in one episode said, "One of my old boyfriends is Barnabas Collins." She mentioned Dark Shadows and Bewitched and Wicked several times. And even Bernard Fox came on Passions as Dr. Bombay. They called him Dr. Bombay.
Wow.
So Passions was a supernatural serial. And since then, Days of Our Lives has had another possession by the devil storyline. But you're right. Dark Shadows back then, at least, was certainly unique. The Edge of Night was a mystery crime drama suspense serial with love stories too, but nothing supernatural. So Dark Shadows was unique. Now, in 1969, in Canada, there was a new soap opera that lasted for almost a year called Strange Paradise. It was syndicated, and it might have run in your city back then, and later it has run on cable channels. But Strange Paradise began from day one as a supernatural show about voodoo and weird mythologies and killers, and even a sci-fi element of one character being cryogenically frozen and revived. So Strange Paradise did exist in 1969 and 1970. But Dark Shadows, was unique in that, no, there were no other horror type shows on daytime television back then, except, if, the Wolfman aired on the afternoon movie or something.
Right.
But nothing new and original before Dark Shadows went 100% supernatural.
Okay, a few minutes there, and I learned a heck of a lot. Okay, some things I got to look up. Strange Paradise and a couple soaps. Okay, that's very interesting. Didn't mean to throw you off there. You can continue on there with Dark Shadows. But
actually, I have a couple questions first, because there's the most iconic scene to me is when Barnabas Collins first makes his appearance, when he reaches out of that coffin and strangles the guy who opens it. And to me, that still scares the heck out of me.
Wow.
I want to know how there's also 2 Dark Shadows movies. Is that true? And how do they reflect in the timeline of the TV series?
they cannot be reconciled with the TV show, but neither can the comic books, the Gold Key Dark Shadows comic books. Neither can Dan Ross's series of paperback novels about Dark Shadows. But all of us, the three of us, and you watching or listening right now, all of us have read comic books and read science fiction and seen Star Trek and Doctor Who, so we know all about alternate realities, parallel universes. Parallel time was on Dark Shadows, the multiverse. So we just have to realize that the different movies and incarnations of Dark Shadows are just alternate realities. But the two movies made at the time with the original cast members were House of Dark Shadows, 1970, and Night of Dark Shadows, 1971. It was filmed right after the show ended and didn't come out until about 4 months after Dark Shadows was off the air. But of course, all of us fans were still mourning the loss and still reading the comic books and reading Dan Ross's paperback novels and collecting the trading cards, the puzzles, the games, the LP records, the masks, everything. House of Dark Shadows is a condensed retelling up to a point of the introduction of Barnabas storyline, because it recreates how Willie Loomis goes to the mausoleum and breaks the chained coffin open, and the hand comes out, and Barnabas puts him under his power and makes him his servant. But then it goes in a much different direction, because it's bloodier, it's gorier, it's much more like the Hammer Christopher Lee Dracula movies and the AIP vampire movies of the day. But that was Dan Curtis's original idea. He finally got to make Barnabas as the marauding, rampaging killer that he planned to do at the beginning of his time on the TV show. So the House of Dark Shadows is much more intense. It's bloodier, and more characters die or become vampires, and so that couldn't be done on TV. But it made a lot of money for MGM, and got very good reviews. Not in mainstream press, which looked down on almost all horror movies, but I'm talking about magazines like Cinefantastique that called it the best vampire movie of 1970. When you had Taste the Blood of Dracula and Scars of Dracula and others out at around that same time. And Donald F. Glut has complimented it back then and still to this day, saying that it's a great vampire movie. But because of everything that happens and the way it ends and what happens to Barnabas at the end, it doesn't tie into the TV show at all. And then because it was a success and made money for MGM asked Dan Curtis to make a second movie. And Curtis wanted to make another vampire movie and wanted to use Barnabas. And it perhaps would have been a condensation and remake of the 1795 story, so that Laura Parker as Angelique could come into the story. But by that time, Jonathan Frid was not interested in playing Barnabas anymore. He didn't even play Barnabas for the last couple of months of the show. He created a new character was created for him, because he was afraid of being typecast, as so many people like George Reeves and Adam West were. So Frid walked away from the whole idea. So Dan Curtis and Sam Hall, one of the writers of the TV show, decided to go in a different direction and do a ghost story, more of a cerebral, weird, haunting ghost story, kind of like The Haunting, or a movie like that. And it's very similar to the 1970 parallel time storyline on the show that starred David Selby and Laura Parker. And that storyline, of course, is patterned after the great novel and film Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and the Alfred Hitchcock movie about the man who brings his new bride to his big brooding ancestral home, but the ghostly presence of his first wife is still there. Her mark is everywhere in the house, and the new wife can't fight it, especially because the dour housekeeper is so devoted to the memory of the first wife that she dislikes the new wife.
Was that Rebecca?
That same plot was used in The Haunted Palace with Vincent Price, and then again in a movie that Kate Jackson starred in, along with Night of Dark Shadows, Death at Love House. So Kate Jackson did that movie twice. But David Selby played a different version of Quentin Collins, who now has inherited Collinwood, and he brings his new wife, Kate Jackson, there. And Grayson Hall plays the housekeeper who is devoted not to a first wife this time, but to a woman, Angelique, who had lived in the house in the year 1810. And the housekeeper believes that she is the reincarnation of a young girl, the housekeeper's daughter who lived there in 1810 and knew Angelique. And she convinces Quentin that he is the reincarnation of his ancestor, Charles Collins, who had a love affair with Angelique. So there are no vampires, but there are ghosts. But you may have heard the sad story about how Night of Dark Shadows was heavily edited. So much was cut out of it. I write about it in my books, and Darren Gross has written about it in Video Watchdog. But if we could see the whole 2 hour and 9 minute version of Night of Dark Shadows, it might be a minor masterpiece of 70s cinema. But it was a little too long. It was 2 hours and 9 minutes. And so Curtis showed it to James Aubrey, who was the head of MGM at that time. Earlier, he had been the head of CBS, and his nickname was the Smiling Cobra, because he had the reputation of being very, very difficult. And at MGM, he allegedly had tampered with movies by Blake Edwards, Ken Russell, and Sam Peckinpah, and now wanted to eviscerate Night of Dark Shadows. And he said, it's too long. It's too long, Danny boy. It won't work. It won't work. I need you to cut it down. And so Aubrey wanted Curtis to cut it to about 97 minutes and gave him only about 24 hours or less to do it. And so Curtis and an MGM film editor sat in the booth all night and cut it all apart and tried to put it back together and make some sort of sense of it. Now, now Hollywood legend says that Dan Curtis got so mad at James Aubrey that he went over the table at him. I don't know whether that is true or not, but
cutting up a half hour of his movie. Jeez.
Yes, yeah, and so eventually it was cut all the way down to about 93.5 minutes. So what you have is a very intriguing, very atmospheric and eerie movie that really shows off Lyndhurst, the historic home in Tarrytown, New York, where both movies were filmed. But some of it doesn't make as much sense as it should, and many scenes that would have explained things, such as a character's limp or scar, or why one character tries to drown another character, and why another character laughs at a certain point, is missing. And so luckily the entire shooting script is available and has been since the 1980s. And
but we'll never see
in 1999, the aforementioned Darren Gross located all of the cut footage in a salt mine in Kansas City, where MGM was storing many films whole films and film clips and outtakes underground in a salt mine, which would preserve keep a good atmosphere for the films. And so Darren Gross found the lost footage, and it was all there, but it didn't have sound. But in years since then, early to mid 2000s, all of the living actors, David Selby, Kate Jackson, Laura Parker, John Carlin, Nancy Barrett, James Storm, others, Christopher Pennock, went into a recording studio and redubbed the missing dialogue.
Nice.
And at one of the Dark Shadows festivals, David Selby was talking to me about it, and he said, "That's the hardest I've ever worked." He said, "We didn't follow the script back then. We paraphrased a lot of our lines, as many actors do, and so what you see us when our mouths are moving on the screen, it's not exactly the words that are in that script." So he said we had to call in lip reading specialists to tell us exactly what they thought we were saying, and then we had to match, the timing and rhythm to it. So all of it has been recreated, and in 2012, when both movies came to Blu-ray, all of us fans were hoping that that Night of Dark Shadows would be the restored 2-hour version. There is some missing footage from House of Dark Shadows, but it was not kept. It has never resurfaced, so it doesn't exist. But all of this from Night of Dark Shadows still exists. And they even got a voice artist, a mimic artist, I guess, to read Grayson Hall's lines, because she, of course, had died by that time. So it's all there, and MGM unfortunately just doesn't want to pay to have it put together, especially because the 2012 Dark Shadows movie was only a mid-level success and not, a runaway franchise that would have given way to a second and third movie itself. But we continue to hope that someday we'll see all of that footage. And Darren Gross and Dark Shadows Festival chairman Jim Pearson have exhibited some of the silent footage at some Dark Shadows festivals. And then I write all about, the missing scenes in my books, especially the television horrors of Dan Curtis, and explain, what was left out. And you can get a good idea of what the movie would have been like. It would have even had a seance scene in it. And we would have learned that a character we thought was a witch was not a witch, and was unfairly condemned. So it would be a totally different movie.
So did they record dialogue? I mean, do we got a complete product and they just haven't released it?
Yes.
Okay.
Probably more needs to be done with color correction and timing and music and things like that. But as far as I understand, the actors did re-record the lines that were not on the soundtrack anymore. And so it is almost complete, but who knows when or if it will ever see the light of day, but we hope that it will.
Yeah, I hope so too, right, Dave?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned you met David Selby, and I know him from Falcon Crest more than anything, and I see him online. He's very active on Twitter. Have you met Laura Parker?
Oh, yes. Laura, all of the Dark Shadows stars are wonderful people who truly are friends with each other. They get along, and for the most part got along back then. They were a close-knit group, and they took the show seriously, and it was like a family atmosphere for the most part. And their friendships have been strengthened over the decades when they have seen each other every year at Dark Shadows festivals. And Catherine Lee Scott and Laura Parker remained close friends for all of Laura's life, and Marie Wallace is friends, and um, uh, Jim Storm and Chris Pinnock became very good friends. So Laura Parker was wonderful. She was very nice to talk with, not just about Angelique or Race with the Devil or Save the Tiger or her other movies and all of her TV shows, The Incredible Hulk, Galactica 1980, Switch, Kung Fu, Policewoman, Kojak, everything. But she, later in life began writing and wrote novels that expanded on the history of her character Angelique. And then she went back and got a Master's of Fine Arts and wrote her dissertation about. She tied it in with Freud's The Uncanny and wrote about Gothic and horror literature. And mentioned Dark Shadows and Dan Curtis, of course. But then she also became a teacher. She began teaching English in high schools and colleges. And so the last few times that I would see her, we talked about what we're doing with our students. I told her, well, I use Richard Cory. I use that poem with my students, and I use this. I do this with them about subject-verb agreement or pronouns or whatever. And so we would talk a little bit about what we've been doing with our students. So, but Laura was a wonderful person. There was a memorial service for her in Los Angeles for just her close friends. There will be a huge event, coming up in Los Angeles, celebrating her life and commemorating what would be the 100th birthday of Jonathan Frid. But this was just a regular memorial service that regular people went to, some of the Dark Shadow stars, but most of the people there were just all of her friends, people she had known for years, or women who had been in her Mother's Day Out group or in her book clubs and things like that. So I heard that it was a very lovely, very sweet service for a very wonderful lady.
Very cool. Yeah, no. Geez, I just can't say how much I love you being here, man. This is great storytelling. You got a wealth of knowledge. I can't believe it. Dare I do this? Are we done with Dark Shadows, or do we continue talking about Dark Shadows? Because
I have too many notes already.
Okay, well, I have something. I'm going to throw this out there. I think I know what the answer is, but I'd like to ask each of you, Barnabas Collins or Kolchak? Start with Jeff.
Well, there have been several short stories and comic books in which Barnabas Collins and Carl Kolchak meet each other.
Right.
Both of them are iconic characters. You can't really compare them because they are polar opposites. One is the Dracula and the other is the Van Helsing. Barnabas is the vampire and Kolchak is the one who wants to get rid of the monsters. But I guess that's why they both, definitely deserve their iconic immortal status. And of course, we have to go back to the actors. Another actor playing Barnabas or another actor playing Kolchak would have been okay, or maybe not good at all. But those two actors, Frid and McGavin, really sold those parts and really imbued them with personality and soul and history. So that's why we're talking about them right now, because those characters, like all of the great characters, Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Superman, Batman, will always be around, and people will always know them and read them and make movies and stories and comic books about them.
And you're right. How can you compare the two? I mean, they're both kind of polar opposites in who they played. So I'll nix that there, Dave.
Okay, good, because I wasn't going to answer because I didn't think it was fair. I was going to say Basil Rathbone.
There you go. Yeah. You want to touch on Norliss Tapes a bit? Because
Oh,
you kind of got me into that right after Kolchak. And
I love the Norliss Tapes. I love how I love the story. I saw it on a rainy day. Weather plays such a big part in that film. Angie Dickinson does a great job. I love that she's still with us today. And it's a wonderful story. And I love also, is it Claude Akins that is also in that film as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Norliss Tapes is terrific and has a cult following like Dark Shadows and Kolchak, especially because it was almost mythic for decades because it has never come out on VHS and came out on DVD only in I think 2006 or 8. It has run on the Fox movie channel and things like that, but rarely. So if you saw it back then, great. If you didn't, you missed a great one. But the Norliss Tapes was very definitely a reaction to the success of Kolchak. It came out, after the first two movies and after Curtis had stopped any kind of Kolchak project.
And was it
So
on a different network as
yeah,
well?
it was on NBC
Okay.
instead of ABC. But it was similar in the idea of a mortal writer, reporter investigating the supernatural. But Roy Finnis, who would go on to be on the 1991 Dark Shadows, did a great job in his part, and of course Angie Dickinson and Hurd Hatfield, the picture of Dorian Gray. Dan Curtis tried to bring back all of the great character actors that he loved from old Hollywood and early television, like John Carradine and Margaret Hamilton and Scott Brady and Hurd Hatfield in this movie and so on. But the Norliss Tapes was written by William F. Nolan, who co-wrote Burnt Offerings with Curtis and wrote the Melvin Purvis movies, and of course had a great career as in science fiction, co-author of Logan's Run and author of the Logan's Run sequels, and he wrote biographies of Dashiell Hammett and Ray Bradbury and other great writers. So Bill Nolan was one of a kind. He could do everything and did in his life. He died, I think, in 2021. I got to talk to him a few times on the phone about Dan Curtis, but Bill Nolan wrote the Norliss Tapes, and it was obviously a pilot for what they hoped would be a series. David Norliss himself is now missing and might never have appeared on the show in real time because every week his editor would have picked up one of the cassette tapes, the Norliss Tapes, and put it in the recorder, the tape recorder, tape player, and listened to the voice of David Norliss, who now is missing and presumed whatever, tell him the story of this is another example of what I have run into in the world of the paranormal. He started out not believing in any of it, but because of this case that is dramatized in this movie and others, he now has PTSD or has had some sort of breakdown or maybe been abducted or killed because of his deep immersion into the world beyond. So this movie, was sort of a mixed bag of a lot of different things. There was some Egyptian mythology thrown in, and a vampire angle, and a zombie angle, even a golem type angle, and it truly is a scary movie. It is very unnerving and scary, and you're right. Bill Nolan said that movie was great because it never stopped raining. So he picked up on what you just said about the atmosphere that he and Curtis put into the movie. And Curtis also was really good at injecting local color or a sense of place into his movies. Obviously, Las Vegas is the whole background, the whole milieu of the Night Stalker, and then we see a lot of scenes of Seattle and in the Night Strangler, and so many of his movies, are against a very definite, concrete background of here is a real place. This is what it looks like. This is how it feels. And the Norliss tape was made up in Monterey, in that area, and you see at one point a character driving a car on one of those amazing bridges, that goes over a chasm overlooking the ocean, and so it too had a palpable sense of place. And I wish it had become a series. I wish we could have had a few seasons of Kolchak and a few seasons of Norliss. And Bill Nolan had already written the second script. It was called The Return, and this one involved time travel. David Norliss was going to go back in time and meet his younger self. But at that time, a writer's strike happened to come up, and it stalled projects. And the Norliss tapes, while well received, was not the breakout hit that Kolchak was, so it didn't go forward. But I really wish that it had. I wish we could have seen more of David Norliss.
Yeah, that would have been definitely cool. I'd like to bring up something here if you want to talk about this for a few minutes. Dan Curtis's Scream of the Wolf was also similar to Kolchak in several ways, and even Joanne Plug from Night Strangler was in it. Anything to say about that movie? I have not seen that yet.
Yeah, well, you can find it on dollar DVDs because unfortunately it's in public domain.
Okay.
It somehow slipped into public domain, like so many of those wonderful ABC movies of the week have done. I loved the ABC movie of the week that ran from 1969 to 75 because, with the exceptions of a few dramas and comedies, almost every week was suspense, occult, mystery, ghosts, vampires. Dan Curtis did Trilogy of Terror and Scream of the Wolf and the two Kolchak movies for the ABC movie of the week. But I was on horror host Dr. Gangrene's TV show when he showed Scream of the Wolf, and I talked a little bit about the movie. And you're right, it too has there's a scene where the city, and that one I can't at the moment think of what place where it was filmed, but the city, which is a real place, had a meeting to discuss what they thought was the werewolf killings or whatever was going on, and a loud, rowdy reporter disrupts the news conference, heckling and asking too many questions. And so that, of course, is exactly like what happens in the Kolchak movies.
Good movie though.
Oh yes, it's a minor Dan Curtis production. It's not something earth-shaking like Trilogy of Terror or Burnt Offerings or Kolchak, but it's still very well done. A great cast. Joanne Flug is always wonderful, and of course Peter Graves and Clint Walker, and Don McGowan, who played the creature from the Black Lagoon on land in one of the movies. He's in it. This one was also written by Richard Matheson, but based on a short story called The Hunter, although Matheson didn't use much from the story. Most of it was original. But of course, it also evokes Richard Connell's classic short story, The Most Dangerous Game, which has been done so many times in movies, and so many times. Falcon Crest, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Heart to Heart, The Incredible Hulk did episodes where a human is hunting another human. So that there's an element of that in there. But Peter Graves was always very complimentary of Dan Curtis. Of course, Peter Graves was in both of the World War II miniseries. And so many actors worked with Curtis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times because they liked him. Polly Bergen of the Two War miniseries said he could be difficult, but he never was with me. And Peter Graves said he knew exactly what he wanted, and if he could get it quietly, he did, or if he had to do it loudly, he would be loud to get it. But Peter Graves said I enjoyed working with him every time I worked with him. And Clint Walker was thrilled to be in this movie, and almost was not, because the part they offered, the Clint Walker part, to Jack Palance. And Palance, I think, wanted a little too much money. And Clint Walker said, well, look, I don't want to give too much away, but he said, if Jack Palance plays that part, people are going to think he's the bad guy from the very beginning. But if I play the part, they won't know whether I'm good or bad. And I think he was right, with the exception of his short-lived TV show Bronx and a few other roles. Jack Palance usually plays some sort of menacing figure. So I think the casting of Clint Walker with Peter Graves was a good idea. So yeah, there were 6 projects that Curtis and Matheson collaborated on. The 2 Night Stalker movies plus Scream of the Wolf, Trilogy of Terror, Dracula, and Dead of Night, which was another trilogy made for TV movie. William F. Nolan was involved in some of those as well. But those are the 6 Curtis-Matheson collaborations. But Matheson had other ideas and even wrote a few other scripts. Curtis loved making his Western, his one and only Western, The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang, and wanted to make another Western. For many years in the 1990s, Richard Matheson wrote different scripts and treatments for Matheson's own Western novel, Journal of the Gun Years, which is a good Western novel. He was going to change the title to Diary of a Gunfighter, which I don't think is as good as Journal of the Gun Years. But Matheson ended up writing a 4-hour script, because in the 90s there were some 2-part TNT Westerns that were being made. And so Matheson was hoping that TNT would want to make a 2-part 4-hour version of Journal of the Gun Years. And the scripts do exist. I have read them and they're good, but they never got off the ground. So, but Curtis had a lot of ideas. There were 2 different scripts of Wuthering Heights written for Curtis, and Curtis wanted to do them, but he wasn't able to. And he had ideas for an anthology series which would have adapted all of the classic horror novels and short stories. But luckily, he did get to do 5 of them when he made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, The Turn of the Screw, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Frankenstein. Many of those for ABC's late night wide world mystery.
Nice. I'd say we're heading towards the bottom of the hour, Dave. If there's one thing more you'd like to talk about, throw it out there.
I know we're up against time, and thank you for spending so much time with us.
Yes.
Jeff.
Oh, you're welcome. I would love to keep talking all night, or come back another time. Or
well, I'll tell you what. That's why I asked Dave to ask for one more topic here, because I definitely need to have you back here. We got to talk more. I'd actually love to have a show where we just talk about film noir, if you would really love to talk about that.
Okay.
Dave, go ahead.
My last thing is how great Karen Black is in Trilogy of Terror. And I know that's way more than we need to talk about, but I just had to give her a shout out.
She should have won an Emmy for Trilogy of Terror. She played 4 different roles in those 3 gripping stories. And then Matheson also wrote another great vehicle for her, The Strange Possession of Mrs. Oliver. That was another 90-minute movie. That one was on NBC, in which she plays a complex character. But yes, Karen Black was wonderful in Trilogy of Terror. Dan Curtis said she really came through for me. And when it came time to make Burnt Offerings, his daughter Tracy Curtis, who had had a bit part in Trilogy of Terror as the little girl whose doll got broken, told Dan Curtis, "Dad, you'd better put Karen Black in your next movie." So Dan Curtis went up to San Francisco and went to the set of Family Plot, the Alfred Hitchcock movie that Karen Black was making. He and Hitchcock never met. That would have been amazing, but they didn't. But he went up to talk to Karen Black and ask her to play the part in Burnt Offerings. And so she did. And Burnt Offerings is one of the best Dan Curtis productions. Of course, we can't compare anything to Dark Shadows, which was 1,225 episodes. But Burnt Offerings, was one of, I guess, of all of his horror projects, it was the most expensive. It was a theatrical film. It was the #1 movie in America for 1 week in October of 1976, and it won the Saturn Award for Best Horror Movie, beating The Omen. And it won a few things. Won an award at a film festival in Spain and a few other things like that. So Burnt Offerings is a fantastic movie and very, very faithful to Robert Marasco's novel up to a point, even to the point where a lot of Marasco's dialogue is in the movie. Curtis and William F. Nolan co-wrote Burnt Offerings. As Curtis said, Nolan took the first half and I took the back half. And it is extremely faithful to the book. Everything that you see in the movie happens in the book, but the ending of Robert Marasco's novel is vague. It's kind of abstract and works in prose literature, but it really wouldn't work trying to be filmed. So Dan Curtis, of course, wanted a much more bombastic, shocking, visceral ending to the movie. And if you've seen Night of Dark Shadows, he admits that I kind of took a little bit of the end of Night of Dark Shadows and put it onto Burnt Offerings. But Dan Curtis said, I'm convinced that the last 15 minutes of Burnt Offerings is the scariest thing I've ever done and the scariest thing you'll ever see. He said the last 15 minutes of that movie are very, very scary. And it's true. If you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, you're in for a great treat. And before we stop, we have to mention Robert Cobert, who composed fantastic music for almost all of Dan Curtis's 46 productions. Dark Shadows wouldn't be Dark Shadows without Robert Cobert's music. There's some TV shows whose music becomes a character, like Batman or Twin Peaks or Downton Abbey. When you hear that music, you think of the show, and if you don't hear that music, it's not the show. So we fans, after Dark Shadows ended, knew a Dan Curtis production, but just by looking or even by listening, because when we heard Robert Cobert's music, we realized, oh, well, this has to be a Dan Curtis movie, because he always works with Curtis. It was a wonderful partnership, like Hitchcock and Herman, or Blake Edwards and Henry Mancini, Steven Spielberg and John Williams. So Cobert was a musical genius and could write in many different styles. The jazzy music he wrote for the Kolchak movies, he called detective jazz. Some of his music cues are traditional horror movie Dark Shadows type scary cues, but then the Kolchak theme was a jazzy type of theme that we remember, and he did a little bit of that in Curse of the Black Widow also. So yes, we can't stop without mentioning the great Robert Cobert. And all of the people who worked with Dan Curtis, Leela Swift, who directed over 800 of the episodes of Dark Shadows and really was Dan Curtis's mentor and helped him learn how to direct. He directed about 21 episodes of Dark Shadows and sort of got his feet wet and learned the nuts and bolts of directing. And then she continued to advise him on House of Dark Shadows. But by that time, and by the time Night of Dark Shadows came, he had become a director, his own director with his own vision. And if you've ever seen a Dan Curtis movie, you know that you're always seeing low angles. The camera is always looking up at the characters. And that is a trademark of Curtis, because he said it's just more interesting. He said, you feel like you're really there. You feel as if you're sitting at the feet of the characters, and you're there with them, and you're looking right at them, and you even see the ceiling above them. So he said, I got the nickname of Mr. Low Angle because I did that all the time. Larry Wilcox, who starred in The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang, called it the hero shot. And I guess sometimes we do literally and figuratively look up to a hero. And so he called it the hero shot.
Yes. And I do believe we probably should end it there. We got way more stuff to talk about, Jeff, if you would be so grateful to come back again.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk in much more depth about Dark Shadows and the movies, and the 1991 Dark Shadows and the 2012 Dark Shadows movie.
And we didn't even touch on Somewhere in Time.
I know. Yes. I show the students, I show Somewhere in Time to my students every semester, and they always love it. And of course, who doesn't? You know, it has a cult following and its own fan organization, Insight, INSITE. Yeah. So, yes, we need to talk about Somewhere in Time because it ties in with Richard Matheson. He wrote the novel and the movie. And we can talk about the Dark Shadows paperback novels and the Dark Shadows comic books and so much more, and all of Dan Curtis's other productions, Curse of the Black Widow, and others that we didn't even mention, Dead of Night, and Trilogy of Terror 2, starring Lysette Anthony from the 1991 Dark Shadows. So we'll have to talk further.
Oh, for sure. Right, Dave?
Absolutely.
This was, oh boy, it's up there. Yeah, I was just, thank you so much for being a part of this and talking, man. I learned so much today. I've got like 3 different shows I got to go look up and find. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, guys, for inviting me. I had a great time talking with you and with all of you who are watching or listening. And maybe some other time we can answer some of the questions that are coming up here on the screen.
Yes. I think they were so involved with what you were saying that they were just like, they were throwing out facts too and just going, this is awesome. So they loved it. It was fantastic. But yes, we will definitely have you on again. And again, everybody in the chat or coming back to rewatch this or watch this for the first time, description in the link below. You will see a link to Amazon where you can get his book. If you love Dark Shadows, he's got a lot of great information, as you just heard. Right, Dave?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Jeff, thank you once again. And, we will have you back on.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. Have a good week. Enjoy the month of June and all summer.
Yes, you too. Last words, Dave?